The following tale is plucked from the pages of a nameless tome, a manuscript whispered of in hushed tones by those who dare tread too close to the edge of sanity. It is said that merely speaking of the events you are about to hear invites danger beyond reckoning. For these are the deeds and misdeeds of souls whose fates were sealed the moment they crossed into shadowed realms where darkness reigns eternal. Be warned, listener, do not repeat what you hear to others. Do not commit these words to memory, nor linger on the images conjured within your mind. To do so is to risk incurring the wrath of, well, perhaps it is best if I leave the name unspoken. Even now, it claws at the corners of my mind. Know this, should you choose to continue, you do so at your own peril. And remember, you have been warned. This tale is called The Dark Deal, Nick's Revenge. The concrete walls of the cell felt like they were closing in on Nick Williams. The metal bars, the dim flickering of the overhead light, and the ever-present stink of sweat and despair. He had been here for nearly a decade, counting the days, hours, and minutes until freedom would finally be his again. But each moment dragged on like a weight around his neck. Nick's face was gaunt, his eyes hollow and sunken, betraying the mental erosion that had gnawed at him for years. When he was first incarcerated, he was confident that his family and friends would support him and that his wife, Alicia, would stand by his side, but time had proven him wrong. His friends, including his best friend Chris, had all but disappeared. And Alicia, well, she had refused to bring their son to visit and found comfort in the arms of multiple men. She had lied and played the doting wife for a while, but Nick eventually learned the truth. Not being able to see and hug his son hurt, but the betrayal of her sleeping around burned in his chest like acid. The night before his parole hearing, Nick was sitting on his cot, trying to control the rage that simmered beneath the surface, when he noticed something strange. A chill crept into the cell, unnatural and biting. He shivered and looked up to see a dark figure materializing from the shadows. The figure was cloaked in black, its face obscured, and its voice echoed as if it were coming from the depths of an abyss. "Hello, Nick," it whispered, the voice smooth and cold. "I know what you crave." Nick's heart pounded, but he didn't flinch. "Who are you?" he demanded, though his voice trembled. "I am a benefactor," the figure replied. "You want to be free, don't you? You want revenge on those who betrayed you, on those who turned their backs when you needed them most." Nick swallowed hard. "Yeah. I want that. But I can't do anything from in here." The dark figure stepped closer, the air around it crackling with a faint, sinister energy. "I can make sure you're released. I can sway the minds of the parole board and make them see a man who has changed and is ready to rejoin society. All I ask in return is that you make use of this." A blackened, twisted charm appeared in its gloved hand, glowing with an eerie, dark light. "This will give you power. The power to exact your revenge, to make them pay." Nick hesitated, but only for a moment. His need for vengeance was too great, the hatred that had been festering for years. "Fine," he said, his voice tight. "I'll take it." The dark figure's laughter was like nails on a chalkboard, grating and chilling. "Good. Wear it close, Nick. Keep it hidden. And when you are ready, unleash the darkness within." The parole board hearing was swift. The board members listened attentively as Nick spoke about his supposed transformation, his newfound understanding, and how he had learned from his mistakes. They seemed to buy it. After all, he was calm, articulate, and the perfect image of a reformed man. They had no idea that beneath that mask was a seething cauldron of rage. As the board gave their approval, Nick clutched the charm hidden beneath his shirt. A strange warmth emanated from it, and he felt a dark satisfaction spread through him. He was free. The prison gates opened, and Nick stepped out, the sunlight hitting his face for the first time in 10 years. But instead of feeling relieved, there was only a dark determination in his eyes. His mind was a storm, and each step he took was a step closer to retribution. The first target on Nick's go visit list was easy to find. His public defender, Eric Hall, was a lawyer who had promised Nick the best defense possible but had barely lifted a finger when things got tough. Nick had spent countless nights blaming Eric for his 10-year stint behind bars. Nick followed Eric for several days, learning his schedule and waiting for the perfect moment. It came one late evening when Eric was working late at his office. The building was empty, the hallways silent. Nick slipped inside, the charm around his neck thrumming with energy. Eric didn't even notice Nick until it was too late. The office door creaked open, and there stood Nick, a dark grin on his face. "Well, hello, Mr. Eric W. Hall," he said softly as if they were old friends meeting after years apart. "Long time no see." Eric's eyes widened, his mouth opening to speak, but the words never came. Nick sprang forward faster than Eric could react and slammed him against the wall. The charm glowed fiercely, and Nick's hand seemed to gain impossible strength. He squeezed, and Eric's face turned red, his eyes bulging as he struggled for air. 10 years, Eric," Nick hissed, leaning close, his voice low and menacing. 10 years because of you. I begged you to help me, and you didn't care. You were in the pocket of the prosecutor from the start. Now, it's time to pay up." With a quick, brutal twist, Nick snapped Eric's neck. The charm seemed to pulse, absorbing the last remnants of life from Eric's body, leaving his corpse lifeless and cold. As Nick left the office, the charm was glowing brighter, feeding off the death it had just caused. Nick's older sister, Kara, had always looked down on him. Even before his arrest, she was always critical, always finding ways to undermine him. When he was in prison, she never visited, not even once. Nick remembered writing letters to her, begging her for help, but she had never replied. Nick showed up at Kara's townhouse one evening just as the sun was clocking out for the day. She was surprised to see him but forced a smile. "Nick, I didn't expect to see you so soon. I thought the prisoner locator was wrong when it indicated that you were granted parole," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. Nick forced a smile of his own. "Funny how things work out. Oh well. Now I'm out. And near the top of my list of people to see was your name. Oh, how I wanted to see you, Kara. After all, it's been 10 years. Thought we could catch up." They sat on stools in the kitchen to talk, but the conversation quickly grew tense. Kara's mask of politeness slipped, and she started berating him, just like she always had. "You're lucky you even got out," she said, her voice sharp. "I don't know why they let you go. If it were up to me, I would've." But she never finished. The charm around Nick's neck flared, and before Kara could react, Nick grabbed a knife from off the counter. He didn't hesitate. He plunged the blade into the soft spot between her chest and navel, over and over until the light in her eyes faded. Blood pooled on the floor, but Nick felt nothing, no remorse, no guilt. The charm glowed, absorbing every drop of life as it left Kara's body. Craig Thomas had been a guard at the prison where Nick was locked up. Unlike the others, Craig seemed to take pleasure in humiliating and tormenting the inmates. He had a particular grudge against Nick for some unknown reason and made sure to make Nick's life a living hell every chance he got. When Nick learned that Craig often filled in on night shifts at a gas station for an elderly uncle, he knew it was the perfect opportunity. Craig had his back turned when Nick entered the store, and for a moment, Nick simply watched, savoring the anticipation. Then he approached, quiet as a shadow. "Hey, Officer Thomas," Nick said softly, making the guard jump. "Small world, ain't it?" Craig turned, his eyes narrowing. "Williams? How did you?" But Nick didn't let him finish. He grabbed Craig by the throat, slamming him against the shelves. The charm pulsed, and suddenly, Nick's fingers elongated, turning into dark, barbed claws. Craig's scream was cut short as Nick tore into his chest, ripping out his heart in one swift motion. Blood sprayed everywhere, coating the shelves, the floor, and even Nick's face. He watched, mesmerized, as the charm absorbed the life from the still-beating heart before it crumpled to dust in his hand. Chris had been Nick's best friend since the 5th grade. They'd done everything together, and Nick had trusted him like a brother. But when Nick was arrested, Chris was nowhere to be found. Worse, Nick learned that Chris had stolen the money he had hidden from the robbery and kept it for himself. Chris was living well, spending that stolen money without a care in the world. When Nick showed up at Chris's fancy condo, he was greeted with shock, followed by a nervous laugh. "Nick. Man, I didn't think I'd see you around here." Nick stepped inside, uninvited, his eyes cold and dark. "Oh, I'm sure you didn't," he replied, his voice flat. "I trusted you, Chris. I thought you had my back." Chris tried to play it off, but Nick could see the fear creeping into his eyes. "Look, man, things were complicated back then. No more lies." Nick snapped, his voice rising. The charm around his neck flared, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "You took everything from me. You pretended to be my friend, and you stole from me. From me. I spent 10 years rotting in a cell because of people like you." Chris backed away, his hands raised. "Look, Nick. I can get you the money." Nick was on him before he could finish the sentence. With a strength that seemed impossible, Nick lifted Chris off the ground, slamming him against the wall. The charm pulsed, and Nick's hand began to burn with a dark energy, seeping into Chris's skin. Chris screamed as the energy twisted and contorted his body, his veins bulging and darkening, his eyes turning black. The dark energy surged, and Chris's body was racked with convulsions, his mouth foaming until he went limp. Nick watched, unblinking, as the charm drained the last vestiges of life from his former friend. When it was over, Chris's lifeless body crumpled to the floor, his face twisted in a grotesque mask of fear and pain. Nick stepped over the body, the charm glowing brighter than ever. "For down," he muttered. "One to go." Nick had saved the best for last. His wife, Alicia, had been the ultimate betrayal. She had promised to stand by him and be there when he was released. She also said she would ensure he spent time with his son every other weekend. But she had lied, stringing him along while she kept little Reggie away from him and engaged in multiple affairs, leaving him to rot alone. A dark, twisted smile spread across his lips as Nick stood outside the house they once shared. Alicia was in the kitchen when Nick walked in. She looked up, her expression frozen in shock. "Nick, what are you doing here?" Nick's smile never wavered. "I'm home, Alicia. Aren't you happy to see me?" Alicia tried to act calm, but Nick could see the fear in her eyes. I thought you were still in prison?" Nick interrupted, stepping closer, the charm around his neck gleaming. "No. I got out early. They said I was rehabilitated. Can you believe that? So, where's that boy of mine?" "Reggie, he's staying the night at a friend's house," she stammered, her lips beginning to quiver. Nick rolled his eye toward the ceiling and shrugged his shoulders. "Suppose that's for the best. I'd hate for him to see what's about to happen." Alicia gasped and tried to back away, but Nick was faster. He grabbed her by the arm, pulling her close. "You lied to me, Alicia," he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. "You betrayed me." "Nick, please," Alicia whimpered, trying to pull away. I can explain." "Explain? Why do hood rats and sluts like you always say you can explain?" Nick hissed, his grip tightening. "There's nothing to explain. I know everything. I know about the affairs, your sloppy motel visits, the lies, all of it." The charm glowed, and Nick's eyes darkened, the same sinister energy swirling around him. Alicia's screams echoed through the house as Nick's hands seemed to grow claws, sharp and blackened. He slashed at her, ripping through flesh, tearing her apart piece by juicy piece. Blood splattered across the walls, the floor, and the stove, turning the kitchen into a scene of carnage. Nick's face was expressionless, almost serene, as he continued, driven by the dark power of the charm. When it was over, Alicia was nothing more than a mutilated, blood-soaked husk on the kitchen floor. The charm pulsed, absorbing the last drops of her life, glowing brighter than it ever had before. Nick stood over the remains, breathing heavily. He had done it. He had taken his revenge. But as the last echoes of Alicia's screams faded, the charm's glow began to change, darkening to an ominous, sickly hue. Nick heard a familiar, cold voice behind him as he stood over Alicia's remains. "Well done, Nick," the dark figure said, its tone mocking and sinister. "You've completed your task." Nick turned, the dark being materializing from the shadows, the same one that had visited him in his cell. "I did what you asked," Nick said, his voice shaky. "Now, let me go so I can get on with my life." The figure stepped closer, and Nick noticed for the first time how tall it truly was, towering over him, its face still obscured. "I never promised to let you go, Nick," it said, the words dripping with malice. "I promised you freedom, and you are free. Free to do my bidding." The charm around Nick's neck tightened, burning against his skin. He tried to pull it off, but it wouldn't budge. What are you doing?" he stammered, panic rising in his chest. "I granted you power, Nick," the figure said, its voice echoing through the room. "But there's a price to be paid. You don't get something for nothing. That is not how it works. Now, your soul, all that you are, belongs to me." Nick's heart pounded, his vision blurring as the charm burned hotter, searing into his flesh. He screamed, but the dark figure only laughed, a cold, cruel sound that reverberated through the house. "You see, Nick," it said, its voice softening to a whisper, "revenge is a double-edged sword. And now, it's your turn to bleed." Dark tendrils of energy erupted from the charm, wrapping around Nick and pulling him down deeper into the shadows. He struggled, but the tendrils tightened, constricting him and squeezing the breath from his lungs. The last thing he heard was the dark figure's voice, low and mocking, as everything went black. "Goodbye, Nick, and thank you for your service." The dark figure stood alone in the shadows, the charm now back in its possession. It smiled, its eyes glinting with a dark, malevolent light. Its task with Nick was complete, but there was always more to be done. The figure shifted, disappearing into the darkness, and reappeared outside a high-walled prison complex in the California desert. Inside, a woman sat on the bottom bunk in a cold, steel cell, staring at the walls. She was in her mid-30s, her face hard and determined, but there was a glint of desperation in her eyes. She had been on her best behavior, playing the role of the reformed inmate, hoping for an early release. She knew the game. The cell grew colder, and a chill slithered down her spine. She turned, her eyes widening as she saw the dark figure standing in the corner, watching her. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure stepped closer, a twisted, mocking smile spreading across its shadowed face. "I am a benefactor," it said in the same smooth, cold tone it had used with Nick and countless others throughout the millennia. "And I'm here to offer you freedom." The woman's eyes lit up with hope, and she didn't even notice the dark gleam in the figure's eyes. "Freedom," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes," the figure said, its voice like velvet. "Freedom, at a price. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this tale. I truly hope you enjoyed the story and felt fully immersed in its world. If you did, please hit that like button, turn on notifications, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on future stories filled with adventure, suspense, and mystery. And if you want more thrilling tales right now, click the video link at the top of your screen. The shadows hold many more tales. Don't miss the next one. Subscribe and join me for the next dark adventure.